everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our Thriving Beyond webinar series, Strategic Restructuring, Collaborations and Partnerships to Ensure Sustainability. Today we have Tom Tabitza from the Knox Law Firm and Deb Thompson from Strategy Solutions as your presenters. All of you will be muted throughout the duration of today just to minimize background noise. We are recording this and we'll make sure you have the slides and the recording available to you after this session. If you have a question or something you would like to ask one of the presenters to clarify, please use the question and answer feature of Zoom and we'll do our best to respond to those as time allows. Please note that if we do run out of time and you still have a question, our panelists are able to stick around for a few more minutes and they'll be happy to answer your question. We'll also make sure you have contact information that shows up later. So if you have a question and are unable to ask it today, please feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to answer your questions at a later point. So with that, I will let Deb introduce herself.
Okay, thanks so much, Jackie. Hi, I'm Deb Thompson, President and CEO of Strategy Solutions, and delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you today about strategic restructuring. I have lots of background and experience in strategic and organizational development, including program development and evaluation, and have worked with and facilitated many cross-agency collaborations and joint ventures over the course of my career. I'm also delighted to have with me Tom Tabitza from the Knox Law Firm, who has also been involved in many, many types of collaborations, and I'll give Tom an opportunity to introduce himself.
Well, thanks, Deb. Thanks, Jackie. And I, too, am delighted to be with you this afternoon and to be partnering with Strategy Solutions and the Nonprofit Partnership and panel on this very important topic, which, frankly, we're going to have to compress a lot into a short period of time, but that's great. And although I have clients in the private and public sectors at the Knox Law Firm, where I've been practicing for well over 25 years. I won't go into detail on that, but my real passion and focus has been with nonprofits, certainly with governance and compliance, but also with financing and real estate matters. So very much interested in this topic, and let's plunge right in with our objectives. I guess I would say that, you know, by way of background, it's very hard to say that there's something good that comes out of a situation like this. Obviously, there's a lot of tragedy out there, and there's a lot of heartbreak, you know, health-wise and economic and so forth. But I suppose in the nonprofit world, we're all in the business of hope and looking for the good in any situation and trying to bring good out of it. So I think that's part of what we're talking about today. And perhaps one of the positives that can come out of the experience that we're all going through right now is to take a look at how we can really strengthen our organizations. And certainly a key part of that is looking at collaboration and partnerships. It's something that many nonprofits are afraid to talk about, because it can be scary and it can be difficult, and that's what we want to help you through a bit today. But it's very important, and it might be life-saving for many nonprofit organizations at this point. So, you know, that's our first objective, to recognize that collaborations and partnerships may be indeed a best alternative as a long-term strategy at this point. But in order to do that, we have to explore, because simply running into a situation like this can do more harm than good if you have not developed in advance meaningful criteria as to what a good and positive relationship would be with you and what sort of an organization you would want to collaborate or partner with, and without the tools and methods to build the trust that's important to any relationship. So again, we're recognizing a need, but recognizing also that we need tools, and we need those to be very specific and identifiable in this rapidly changing time. So those are our three major objectives. And so we go on to this next slide. Let me say on this, because I think this formula is very important, but before I get into it, I did read an interesting quote yesterday that said that if you push the pause button on a computer, it stops. But if you press the pause button on a human being, and I guess I would say by extension on an organization, that's really when some new ideas and creativity can maybe start. And so that's really what we're looking at here is how can these elements of this formula that we have in front of us, leadership, adaptability, and capacity in a changing world, lead to sustainability. I guess I would say that all of these things are obviously very much needed in the current environment: leadership, adaptability, capacity. And how does that feed into collaboration? Well, obviously, we need lots of leaders right now. We need all the smarts that we can get. We need all the nimbleness we can get. We need all the capacity we can have. And so all the programs that we've worked on over the years about how you build a strong board, how you build strong leaders, how you build good relationships between executive directors or CEOs and board chairs, all those things become important right now. And the more collaboration and partnership you're doing, frankly, the more leadership and the more capacity you're going to have. So that's just, I think, a fundamental part of this equation. And one of the reasons we want to make sure that all those elements are in place, because that's the only way that we get to sustainability. So Deb, do you want to add anything on that slide?
Yeah. As we hear people say, well, when things get back to business as usual, that's probably never going to happen. So we have to be really thinking differently now about what the new normal looks like in the future. Go ahead on to the next slide. So we have to really start thinking differently about what is going to happen in the future world. And I've heard a number of forecasts over the last week or so that are suggesting that maybe up to half of the nonprofits that exist in the world today may be gone by the end of this year. And as difficult as it is for us to think about it, everybody that's a nonprofit leader today has to look at our organization and say, do we really have a sustainable business model? And if we don't, we really have to be saying, what can life look like for us? And I think the key strategic question that we really need to think about is, can we build a collaborative corporate support model that allows our nonprofit programs to retain their individual identity? And I love the Yum Corporation, Pepsi, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken. They're all part of the same company. But it allows them to benefit from cost savings, strong back office operations, and technical expertise. And I think there are potentials for collaborations that are short of merger. Not talking, I hear people say, well, there's going to be lots of merger and acquisition activity happening because people are going to be forced to do it. I personally think if nonprofit leaders start to think about what can new collaborations and partnerships look like, they don't have to be forced in a situation where they have to close or merge, but can come up with some creative partnerships where they in fact can work together.
A great point. I would just add, that that whole idea of brand identity. I mean, we as nonprofits are very proud of our brand. And that's one of the things that we don't want to sacrifice. But as Deb says, there's lots of ways to go through collaboration and partnership where that brand can be preserved and enhanced.
Right. And unfortunately, we have this long list of barriers to collaboration and partnership, and these can either be real or perceived. And one of the stories that I like to tell is about a nonprofit organization. And I am going to mention it by name because what happened to it is tragic, and we shouldn't allow this to happen related to our missions. But the Diabetes Association of Northwestern Pennsylvania actually went out of business a couple of years ago, when prior to that, they had the opportunity to create a strategic alliance and actually a joint operating agreement with the Site Center of Northwestern Pennsylvania. And they actually were talking for some time about creating a joint operating agreement where they could move into the Site Center, take some of the benefit of the Site Center's management infrastructure, but keep the Diabetes Association, its board, as a separate entity and run it as a separate program. And for whatever reason, that didn't happen, and the organization actually dissolved. And what's sad about the situation is that to the benefit of the community, the Site Center actually picked up and started doing all of their diabetes education programs that the association had been doing. However, as part of the Site Center, and they're managing those programs very effectively, but you don't think about the Site Center with a diabetes program, although, yeah, there's a connection there. But in retrospect, it would have been way easier to brand those programs continuing to brand them under the Diabetes Association where they started. But the fear and the barriers to collaboration and partnership got in the way there. And we didn't have the outcome that could have been the potential for the community in that respect. So we're encouraging folks to really think about, get past these barriers now, whether they're real or perceived, and think about what the opportunities are for partnership and collaboration. So what the board should be doing, and Tom talked about the difficulty in today's world of maybe even getting our board members' attention to these issues that are facing us, but the role of the board in the collaboration and partnership should be to think about and determine where and how collaboration and partnership contributes to sustainability, and really think about what's the criteria, what are the parameters, and what kind of partnership might we look for in order to continue to sustain the mission. And the primary focus should be sustaining the mission. And I talk often in governance trainings about the fact that fiduciary responsibility that board members have is to actually continue the mission as long as the need exists. So every board should be asking itself the questions about, you know, how do we continue our mission, even if it looks like it's difficult for us to financially sustain the activities that we have today.
Yes, and Deb, I just would want to add about the board. I don't think we can overstate that point. It was interesting this morning, I was on a call, the large retirement care organization based in Pittsburgh, a fine organization where they were talking about their own response and their own financial strategy for going through it. And when they finally got to the Q&A at the end, and some very excellent board members, the questions actually seemed to revolve more about the experiences that the individual board members were having with their own businesses and what their experience was with the PPP loan and so forth. It just underscored the idea that board members can be very distracted right now because, you know, they are obviously concerned about their own businesses. And so, you know, the nonprofit needs to step up and engage its board members because the board does have a very critical role in this whole process. And it really revolves around what you see on the slide now, which is identifying, vetting the potential partners or collaborators, and particularly in developing the criteria that are used for that identification and vetting. So normally things that are A, B, C, D, E, F, or all the same letter strike me as a bit hokey, but I will say these are A, B, C, D, E, F, and I think they're really pretty good. So we're going to spend a bit of time on them. Alignment obviously is the most important element, I would say, because if mission, programs, values, image, brand, all those things don't fit together, then for a variety of reasons, this is not going to be a happy collaboration. And it's beyond, I think, the question even of sustainability. That certainly is the thing that's foremost on our minds right now. But we also need to look at what new can we do. I've often heard it say that just a couple of weak organizations combining thinking that that's going to make them strong is really not true. I mean, there's got to be some new value that emerges from the collaboration. And so that I think even goes beyond alignment, but certainly alignment is the first step. Benefit, there does need to be a very clear examination of what benefits each would bring to the table. How is the partner going to be complementing our own strengths? And certainly when that question is asked, it's going to be an ongoing evaluation. So we need to figure out how we are going to measure whether that benefit is being realized. Continuity is an important question. Maybe we're simply looking for some help right at the beginning to share stories and ideas about how we can move together as opposed to a longer term strategy. But perhaps we do want to do something a little bit more involved, or even just sticking our toe in the water. So continuity is going to be a question that needs to be addressed up front. Are we really willing to make the commitment to go forward with this, or are we just looking for a short-term answer? That takes us then to the next slide, where we consider delivery. And again, this gets back into the question of capacity. There are all sorts of costs involved in even the examination process of a collaboration. And certainly at a time when we're all very busy, when I made the comment a moment ago about hitting the pause button, it may be true that some people are sitting at home not as busy as they are, but I'm guessing that most nonprofits are busier than usual. So it may be difficult to figure out how to address all this, but it's important that you do so, because you need to be carrying on your mission at the same time that you are examining these opportunities, which is not easy to do, particularly if you are short-staffed. You need to figure out who are the point people going to be on your staff, and who is going to be able to devote time to this. Are there board members who can assist with that are willing to step up and have the ability and the expertise to do that? Equity, obviously, is a very important consideration. Going into a relationship when you're really on your back is probably not the best time to do it. We may not have that luxury at this point. You like to be proactive about this, but the current situation that none of us could have foreseen is maybe forcing a situation where it's not always going to be a marriage of equals. But I think it's important to make sure that there is not such an imbalance that the first time there's a hiccup in the combined organization, if that's the direction you go in, that your mission gets thrown to the side because it was not central to what the more powerful partner was looking to in terms of their strategy. Finances, they're last on the list, but it's obviously critical because money doesn't maybe make the world go around, but it's necessary for sustainability. So currently, the cost and the long-term costs and the long-term income that can be derived are all critical criteria to consider. The next slide.
One of the things to think,
go ahead.
Yeah, and one of the things to think about as we go into this, related to the criteria, we operate under the assumption that if we're a nonprofit, we have to partner with another nonprofit. And that's actually not necessarily true. There's lots of opportunities for nonprofits to collaborate with for-profit organizations in ways that are strategic and helpful. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we, start talking about the different types of partnership strategies. But as we get into this, and Tom's going to explain the different types of partnerships, but the role of the executive director here is the board should be setting the stage and thinking about the criteria for collaboration. The executive director or the staff should be thinking about and coming up with recommendations. Well, what's the best kind of partnership strategy for us? And this is kind of a complicated slide that talks about it's a continuum of collaboration light all the way to, joint venture or a corporate acquisition or a merger on the greater integration side. But there's lots of opportunities in between there for an organization to collaborate with one or more others in ways that's going to be strategically meaningful. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom to talk about the details of the different types of potential collaboration.
Right, and we're going to have to move fairly quickly through some of these. So I encourage you, when you have these slides, to go back and look at them carefully, and we'll be happy to have some dialogue with you about it if you have particular questions. But again, we can't say it too many times. There are a whole spectrum of opportunities along these axes of whether it's administrative collaboration or primarily programmatic, whether you're retaining autonomy or whether you are looking for greater integration, which could be a merger or any variety of joint venture, all sorts of those opportunities. So we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on this chart, but I think this is probably the key chart in the entire presentation, and it's something that you're going to want to to study, because you may be coming at this with the idea that, well, there just aren't there very many options. We just kind of give everything up and turn the keys over to somebody else, and that's not the way this works. So I guess I would suggest that we move on to the next slide, which is starting with really what I would call the, I don't want to use the word weak or light, because that's not the idea, but the least drastic change, let's say it that way, which would be on the collaboration end of the spectrum. And you see examples there. You're simply sharing information, even in a sort of a webinar or conference like this. You may be coordinating some of your programs to make sure that you're not stepping on somebody else's toes, or just, disadvantaging both programs. You can do some joint planning. With all of these, you're not making any permanent commitment, and your own organization is retaining its own decision-making power. So that's the one end of the spectrum. On the next slide, we have, again, a number of options here, but this is still to the left of the original spectrum that we were looking at a couple of slides ago. This does not go all the way over to organizational merger, but it talks about, on the one end, what may be a term that's pretty good is coalition, where you have scheduled routine meetings. It's not just sort of a random kind of a meetup, but you continue to have regular interaction at various levels of your staff, not just at the CEO level, for example. And then as you move across the spectrum, you get to a point where you might actually have merged, in quotes, components of your service delivery. You're doing programming cooperatively, but you are still autonomous organizations, just like those of us who are cooperating on this presentation that we're making right now. So you start to move to more administrative and programming consolidation, but still completely autonomous in a legal sense. We go to the next slide. Here we have some more heavy-duty consolidation, where you may have some shared services. Perhaps you're even sharing a staff member. Much of that goes on in the community more than we know. A bookkeeper, or somebody who is providing services for multiple organizations. There is a more robust menu of joint programming that's involved on a basis that people will come to expect, to know that this is a public-facing cooperative effort in some fashion. And so there's a future commitment now, because as you can see at this point, your reputation is potentially getting tied up with the other organization. And so it does become something that it's a relationship that's going to need more work, where there's going to have to be various shared decision-making power. And since you can't always have everybody sign off on everything, there's more of a trust factor that becomes involved. And if it's not trust, then, or even if it is trust and verify. So write it down in an agreement. We move to the next slide, and here we start getting into the permanent and more serious types of integration. And the first example that's given there is a management service organization. That's more than just, sharing a part-time bookkeeper, but actually having an arrangement where the bulk, perhaps, of the management functions are being carried out in a cooperative fashion by a separate entity or in some other fashion. And then you get into the true legal consolidations, where your core organization may transfer control to another entity, who could be the entity that names the members of your board. It can be, in that scenario, you're still a subsidiary or separate organization, but you've obviously lost some control, because now the board, which ultimately calls the shots, is actually being appointed by somebody else, and they can remove those board members. Or there can be an actual formal merger, or there can be ways of doing joint ventures. So at this point, you can see it's very hard to unscramble the omelet once you've made it. So you need to be very careful when you get to this end of the spectrum. You're careful in all of them, but this is potentially irreversible. So I'll stop there and turn the next steps over to Deb.
So there is a process that one should follow based on best practices in order to determine what your best approach to relationship building is with other organizations. The first is to conduct an internal self-assessment and really look at restructuring as an option. And I encourage all nonprofits in today's environment to go through that assessment and say, who can we partner with, and are there ways for us to be able to lower costs and or to collaborate in order to ensure our sustainability? And then develop some partnership criteria. Look at who might we want to partner with, and set up a collaboration committee as a subcommittee of your board to actually look at the potential vision of a collaboration. And then potentially look at partnerships with other organizations and do an interorganizational assessment, especially with organizations that have complementary missions or who might already be collaborating programmatically. It would be a good idea for you to try to make it more formal during this uncertain time, to see if there's ways for you to be able to create some efficiencies or economies of scale. Then look at the options and say, what's the best structure for us? It doesn't have to necessarily be a full asset merger or a joint venture. It could be a joint operating agreement. It could be sharing management services. And I'll give you an example. Strategy Solutions has a partnership agreement with WQLN, who is our landlord. Okay, so here's an example of a for-profit organization partnering with a nonprofit. We were actually able to consolidate some of our administrative services with them that allowed us to save some dollars when we moved into that building. So there's, again, short of merger, lots of options. And then you want to do your due diligence if you are creating a new organization or a new formal agreement or partnership, and say, what does that look like? And then put together an implementation plan. And it could be done relatively quickly. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, I'm just going to wait, and if things don't work out, we'll think about dissolution. Well, there's a lot of work involved in dissolution. And I've seen a couple of organizations actually dissolve over the last few years. And for the time and effort that boards have to put into actually dissolving, you'd be way better off putting that time and effort into a collaboration or some kind of a joint operating agreement with another organization to continue your mission. So going on to the next slide then, you know, what might be that criteria? Start to think about that. Look, think through it for your organization. And go on to the next slide, please. And then we're wrapping up here with helping you think through, if we're going to develop a relationship with another organization, how do we quickly build trust in this environment in order to get us to where we need to go? This is a great worksheet that shows the different operational definitions of trust and can give you a framework to start talking with another organization and saying, what will it mean to us, and how will we work together, and how will we be together? And this is just a great framework to start some expectations to say, this is what we're going to do and how we're going to work together, so it doesn't take, you know, months or years to develop some basic level of trust. So where do we go from here? Don't worry so much about size or who is bigger or smaller. Think more about good mission fit and how you can be nimble working with another organization. I think that's probably the biggest thing to think about as we move through the next couple of months. Think more about mission fit and the criteria for partnerships for you. And then think about and discuss what can we do to assess our own organization's potential sustainability and consider partnership options, and what can we do to initiate or enhance collaborations and partnerships to improve our own sustainability.
So with that, I will remind everyone that you can use the Q&A or chat features for any questions. So Deb, on the one slide that listed the various steps and things to consider, you mentioned a self-assessment to get started. So is that something that folks can applying somewhere, or what would be involved in that? Can you give any advice to get started with that piece for individuals?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, when we send out the slides and the recording for this webinar, we have a short self-assessment tool that we can include with it that could help people get started thinking through what will be, sort of a good way to jumpstart their thinking. So that's an excellent question. We have some tools that can help.
Great, thank you.
And I have a question for Tom. Tom, from a sustainability perspective and a governance perspective, what would your advice be to the listeners of this webinar as next steps or first steps for them to think through how to get started on this process?
Well, it's certainly an accelerated process in the world we're in right now. I think in the old days you would say, and this was usually executive director driven, you start looking at what is the future of the industry that we are in and what's it going to take to survive. We may need to do that more quickly, but I think looking at that long-term view is important. I mean, just as with the sort of COVID planning and modeling and so forth that's going on, how can you make decisions on the next thing to do as a community if you don't have some sense of what's going to be happening down the road? And certainly you're always operating in an environment of uncertainty, but you need to take a long look, I think, first, where do you want to be down the road? How are your services going to be able to be delivered most effectively in a changing environment? And you've got the end in mind when you get started. So that's I think some futuring work is necessary. I suppose it's the old traditional, SWOT analysis in a way, but again in a compressed format. And then I think culturally, you just have to take the temperature of your current board. If your board has not moved to the place where they understand that change and collaboration are necessary, then you're not going to get very far with it. And I've seen very elaborate planning strategies where management has gone through this with consultants and so forth, and then the whole thing falls apart eventually because the board was not involved enough up front with an educational background as to what the needs are. So again, we're kind of learning this for a compressed time frame, but you need to look at your own culture and what the appetite for change is going to be, and that's going to dictate what steps you take to try to move the needle.
Thank you both so much for that information and all that you shared during today's presentation. So I did just want to remind folks, again, you'll get some of the tools that were discussed today, as well as the recording and the slides from today's presentation. If you have a specific question about what was covered today, please don't hesitate to send an email to either of the emails that are up here on the slide, either debbie@getstrategy.com or info@getstrategy.com. And then I did just want to let everybody know that Strategy Solutions and our team of consultants are here to help. So we know these are challenging, unique times that everyone is facing. So if there's something related to today's topic or just anything that your organization or board is wrestling with, please feel free to give us a call, and we'll be happy to set up a time for you to chat with one of our consultants to have some of that dedicated one-on-one time. So we're offering free 30-minute consultative support. So if you need something specific, please feel free to shoot me an email. That's me down below there. I'm Jackie@getstrategy.com, and I'll be happy to set up a time for you and one of our consultants to chat through anything: planning, fundraising, thinking through a new budget, thinking through planning, thinking through some of this restructuring stuff. Whatever it is, we're here and we're happy to help you. So we do appreciate all of your time today. Hope you are all staying well. And Deb and Tom, thank you again for this informative presentation.
You're very welcome. Take care, everyone.
Have a great rest of the day.